"Don't touch me. I'm not in the mood," she said day after day, until those words stopped sounding like a temporary mood and started feeling like a permanent wall. At first, I told myself it was nothing, just stress, maybe exhaustion from work or personal struggles I didn't fully understand. But when her voice grew colder, sharper, and more dismissive with each repetition, something inside me started to wither. What began as a marriage filled with laughter, closeness, and intimacy slowly transformed into a place where I felt like a stranger in my own home, like my very existence had become an unwelcome intrusion. This is the story of how I kept trying, kept reaching out, kept hoping for the warmth of connection, until the day I realized she didn't want me to try anymore, and I stopped forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. When I look back at those early years with Claire, it almost feels like I'm recalling the life of someone else. I was 28, she was 26, and we met at a mutual friend's wedding in a small lakeside town called Fairhaven. She was standing by the buffet table, holding a glass of white wine, her laughter cutting through the music like sunlight through gray clouds. I was drawn to her instantly, not just by her beauty but by the way she seemed completely at ease in herself. Claire had this rare gift of making everyone around her feel like they belonged, like they were important, like they mattered. That night, we talked about books we loved, our shared dream of traveling across Europe, and our mutual dislike for people who pretended to be someone they weren't. I thought I had found my mirror, my partner, the person who would walk beside me through every storm and every sunny day. Our first months together were magical. We took spontaneous road trips, sang loudly and terribly to songs in the car, and spent long evenings lying on the living room floor, talking about everything and nothing, until the sky outside turned pink with dawn. I loved the way she would rest her head on my chest and trace circles on my arm absent-mindedly. I loved the way she'd kiss me on the back of my neck while I was cooking. Physical closeness wasn't just natural, it was the foundation of how we expressed love, and for a long time I thought that would never change. But life has a way of reshaping even the strongest bonds, sometimes in ways so subtle you don't notice until it's too late. The first time Claire said, "Not tonight, I'm not in the mood," I barely thought about it. We had just come back from a long weekend trip, she was tired from driving, and I understood. It happens to everyone. The second time I kissed her cheek, smiled, and said, "No worries, we'll just cuddle." And we did. But soon those moments grew more frequent. "I'm tired. I have a headache. I'm stressed." The reasons varied, but the message was the same. She didn't want me close. At first I brushed it off. We all go through rough patches, I told myself. Work had been stressful for her. She had just been promoted at the marketing firm she worked for, and the pressure was obvious. She was coming home later, answering emails during dinner, and some nights falling asleep with her laptop still open on the bed. I thought the distance between us was temporary, something that would resolve itself once she adjusted to the new responsibilities. So I waited. I tried to be patient, supportive, understanding. I told myself this was just a season, and like all seasons, it would pass. But the season didn't pass. It deepened. What used to be the occasional, "not tonight," became every night. What used to be playful laughter when I reached for her hand turned into her pulling away. She stopped kissing me goodbye in the morning, stopped greeting me with warmth when I came home. And every time I tried to bridge the gap, whether with a hug, a soft touch on her shoulder, or even just a smile, her words came like a dagger cloaked in ice. "Don't touch me. I'm not in the mood." It's hard to explain how much those words can crush you when they come from the person you love most. It wasn't just rejection, it was erasure. It made me question my worth, my attractiveness, my place in her life. Was I doing something wrong? Had I failed her in ways I didn't understand? I started second-guessing everything. The way I dressed, the way I spoke, the way I touched her. Every rejection carved a deeper wound, and every wound made me feel less like her husband and more like an intruder in her space. The strangest part was how normal everything else seemed. To friends and family, we still looked like the perfect couple. We went to dinners, celebrated birthdays, posted pictures of vacations. Claire was still charming in public, still smiling for the camera, still reaching for my hand when people were watching. But behind closed doors, it was as if a curtain had dropped, and I was left standing in the cold while she retreated into a world where I didn't belong. For months I kept telling myself to keep trying. Maybe if I planned a romantic date, maybe if I surprised her with flowers, maybe if I worked harder she'd open up again. I wanted to believe the woman I fell in love with was still there, hidden beneath layers of stress and fatigue. And so I tried again and again, only to be met with the same sharp words that turned my hope into despair. And as much as it hurt, part of me still clung to the memory of who we had been, blind to the truth that was slowly becoming undeniable. Something fundamental had shifted, and no amount of patience or effort on my part was going to bring us back to what we once had. To understand how much everything eventually unraveled, you first need to know the foundation we built our lives on, because from the outside, it looked like something solid, almost enviable. Claire and I weren't just two people who stumbled into marriage because it felt like the right next step. We genuinely believed we were soulmates. We married after 3 years of dating, in a small church on the edge of Fairhaven, surrounded by wildflowers and the sound of seagulls drifting in from the lake. I can still remember the way she looked walking down the aisle, her eyes locked on mine, her smile both nervous and radiant. When she reached me, she whispered, "We'll always choose each other." And I believed her without question. Those words became the mantra I carried with me, the compass I thought would guide us through every hardship. Our early years together painted a picture of domestic happiness. We bought a modest 2-bedroom house with a small backyard where we planted tulips and daisies. On weekends, we would have coffee on the porch, barefoot, watching the neighborhood slowly come to life. Claire loved to bake, and the smell of fresh bread or cinnamon rolls often filled our home. I loved to cook, so dinners were a shared dance in the kitchen, her teasing me for chopping too slowly, me laughing when she insisted on licking the spoon before washing it. Our friends often told us we looked like the couple who had it all figured out, and in those days I thought maybe we did. Financially, we were stable. Claire's career in marketing took off quickly. She was ambitious, creative, and charismatic. I worked as an architect, designing homes for families that I hoped would feel as warm and welcoming as the one we were building together. We weren't wealthy, but we lived comfortably, and more importantly, we dreamed together. We talked about the places we wanted to travel, the kids we hoped to raise, the life we were sure we were building brick by brick. At night, lying in bed, we would whisper about the future until we fell asleep in each other's arms. I think that's what made the later silence so unbearable. You see, Claire wasn't just my wife, she was my best friend. We shared everything, from our deepest fears to our silliest inside jokes. We had rituals that made our bond feel unshakable. Sunday morning pancakes, Friday movie nights, impromptu dancing in the living room when our favorite songs came on. She had this habit of leaving me little notes in my work bag, just a simple "I love you" or "good luck with your presentation," and I would carry them with me all day like secret treasures. I never imagined a time would come when that closeness would fade, when the woman who once couldn't keep her hands off me would barely tolerate a touch on the shoulder. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Family was another layer of our story. My parents adored Claire, often calling her their daughter rather than their daughter-in-law. Her parents were more reserved, but they respected me, and I thought we were all part of a larger, supportive network. Holidays were filled with laughter, gifts, and traditions that seemed destined to carry on for decades. Claire and I often joked that we were writing the opening chapters of a long, happy book, and I never suspected the plot would twist in such a devastating way. Our community also saw us as a model couple. At church, people would comment on how kind and loving we were with each other. At work functions, colleagues would smile at how attentive I was to her, or how supportive she seemed of me. There was a quiet pride in being seen as the good couple, the one who had figured out the balance of love, friendship, and commitment. I didn't realize at the time how much that perception would later weigh on me, how much it would make me deny the cracks that were forming in private, because I didn't want to admit, even to myself, that the image was just a facade. In those years, I would have described myself as a man who had everything he wanted. My days were structured, purposeful, and filled with small joys. I would wake up early, jog through the neighborhood, then come home to the smell of coffee and the sound of Claire humming while she got ready for work. In the evenings, after dinner, we would sit in the living room with our laptops, her working on a presentation while I sketched out blueprints, occasionally pausing to share a laugh or lean against each other on the couch. We had no reason to believe our lives were anything but ordinary happiness. That's why the shift when it came was so disorienting. I had built my entire identity around being her partner, her confidant, her equal. I had woven our lives together so tightly that I couldn't see where I ended and she began. So when she started pulling away, when the warmth that defined us began to vanish, I didn't know how to react. At first, I told myself it was temporary. At second, I blamed myself. And eventually, I started to lose myself in the silence. But before any of that, there was the setup. The life that made me believe in forever. The life that gave weight to the heartbreak that was coming. Looking back, I realized that Claire never promised me perfection. She only promised we would always choose each other. And I suppose the hardest part of the story is this. One day, without saying it outright, she stopped choosing me. If I trace the story back to where it truly began, the shift wasn't as sudden as I once believed. The unraveling started slowly, in subtle ways that only seemed harmless in the beginning. When Claire first stepped into her new role at her firm, she was ecstatic. I remember her twirling around the kitchen one evening, holding the promotion letter like it was a golden ticket. She was now the youngest senior account manager in her office, a position that came with more money, more responsibility, and more prestige. I was proud of her, deeply proud, because she had worked tirelessly for years to climb that ladder. But what I didn't see then was how much of herself she would sacrifice for that title, and how much of us would be lost in the process. At first, the changes seemed minor. She stayed a little later at the office, answering late-night calls or rushing off to meetings at odd hours. She was tired more often, sometimes falling asleep on the couch while still in her work clothes. I figured it was temporary, the natural growing pains of adapting to a new role. I cooked dinner more frequently, took over small chores she used to handle, and encouraged her to rest whenever she could. I believed that being supportive meant being patient, and I didn't mind carrying more of the load if it meant she could succeed. But while I thought I was helping, I didn't realize I was slowly making myself invisible in her world. We used to talk for hours about everything under the sun, but those conversations grew shorter. Instead of discussing our dreams or sharing jokes, we talked about her deadlines, her difficult clients, her coworkers. I became her sounding board, not her partner. When I would bring up my work or my feelings, she'd listen politely but distractedly, scrolling through her phone or cutting me off with, "Can we talk about this later?" My mind is fried right now. I didn't want to add to her stress, so I backed down, convincing myself that later would come. But later kept moving further and further away until it became never. The intimacy we once had was the next thing to change. Early in our marriage, we couldn't get enough of each other. Even mundane routines felt special because of the physical closeness we shared. She'd grab my hand while grocery shopping, kiss my cheek while folding laundry, or curl against me on the couch without me having to ask. Those gestures made me feel loved in a way words never could. But with her new schedule, exhaustion replaced affection. The first few times she said she wasn't in the mood, I brushed it off with understanding. But as the weeks turned into months, those words became a near-daily refrain. "Don't touch me, I'm not in the mood." They were spoken so casually, so dismissively, that I started to feel ashamed for even wanting her touch. Still, I tried not to panic. Every relationship has its seasons, I reminded myself. People go through busy phases, stressful times, and intimacy can ebb and flow. I believed it was my job to keep showing up, to keep proving my love through patience and consistency. So I brought home her favorite takeout on late nights, left small notes in her laptop bag like she used to do for me, and planned little surprises to remind her that we were still us. Sometimes she would smile and thank me, but her eyes were distant, as though she was already somewhere else. One evening stands out in my memory as the beginning of my quiet desperation. I had planned a simple date night at home. I made her favorite pasta, opened a bottle of wine we had been saving, and even lit candles to recreate the atmosphere of the nights we used to cherish. When she came through the door, I greeted her with excitement, hoping she'd see the effort and feel the warmth we used to share. Instead, she barely looked at the table, muttered something about being too tired, and went straight to the bedroom without even tasting a bite. I sat alone at that candlelit table, staring at the meal I had prepared, the silence pressing down like a weight I couldn't escape. That night I realized that my attempts to hold on to us might not be enough. Another shift came in the way she interacted with me in public versus at home. Around others, she still played the part of the loving wife. At gatherings, she laughed at my jokes, leaned against me for pictures, and held my hand when people were watching. Friends would comment on how lucky we were, how strong our marriage seemed, and I would smile while choking on the truth. But behind closed doors, the distance was undeniable. The touches stopped. The conversations dwindled. The laughter that once filled our home was replaced by the sound of her typing away on her laptop, or the hum of the television while we sat in separate silences. I clung to hope because the alternative was too painful to accept. I told myself it was just stress, that things would get better once she found her rhythm at work. I tried to convince myself that the love we had built couldn't just vanish. And for a while, I succeeded in living in that denial, comforting myself with memories of who we used to be. But in the quiet moments, when I lay awake next to her sleeping form, a cold distance between us in the bed, I began to feel the gnawing truth. The beginning of the end had already taken root, and I was powerless to stop it from growing. Before the decline, there was a period when life with Claire felt like a dream I never wanted to wake from. Those were the good times, the golden years of our relationship. And they remain etched in my memory like a series of vivid paintings. They weren't perfect in the sense that every day was extraordinary, but they were perfect in their simplicity, in the way we managed to make ordinary moments feel like treasures. If you had asked me then what happiness looked like, I would have pointed to the life we were living. Sundays were sacred for us in those days. We would wake up late, sunlight spilling across the sheets, and she'd roll over to nudge me awake with a playful grin. "Come on, lazy bones, pancakes aren't going to make themselves," she'd tease. We would shuffle into the kitchen, hair messy, still in pajamas, and turn on some music. She loved old classics, Fleetwood Mac, Elton John, and we'd dance barefoot across the tiled floor while the scent of batter and coffee filled the room. Those mornings weren't about food. They were about togetherness, about starting the day with laughter and light. I can still picture her humming as she flipped pancakes, leaning in to kiss me on the cheek with a dollop of flour smudged across her face. Our evenings often carried the same intimacy. After long days at work, we would settle on the couch under a shared blanket, picking a movie to watch while we traded stories about our day. She'd rest her head on my shoulder, and I'd absent-mindedly run my fingers through her hair. It was the kind of quiet comfort that made me feel at home no matter what else was happening in the world. Those small acts of affection, the way she'd squeeze my hand during a dramatic scene, or the way she'd look up at me and smile for no reason, created a sense of safety I had never known before. Vacations together were another highlight. One summer, we flew to Oregon and spent a week driving along the coast. We stopped in little towns, ate at diners where the locals welcomed us like family, and walked for hours along windswept beaches collecting shells. Claire loved to take photographs, capturing candid shots of me skipping stones across the water, or us standing arm in arm against a backdrop of cliffs and crashing waves. When I looked at those photos later, I saw joy, not just in her smile, but in the way her eyes sparkled with a light that made me believe we could withstand anything. Even in our day-to-day lives, she had a way of making everything feel vibrant. Grocery shopping turned into an adventure as we'd compete to see who could find the strangest food item. Cooking together often ended in flour fights or burnt dishes we'd laugh about for weeks. One night, after I disastrously overcooked a roast, she dramatically pretended to faint at the table, declaring it a crime against food. Moments like that weren't grand or monumental, but they were ours, and they stitched together a tapestry of memories that gave our relationship its warmth. There was also the way she celebrated me. When I landed my first major architecture project, a family home that would later be featured in a local magazine, she threw a surprise party in our backyard. She invited close friends, decorated the space with string lights, and baked a cake in the shape of a house. I remember standing there holding her hand, feeling like the luckiest man alive. She looked at me with such pride, whispering, "I told you you'd do it," and in that moment I believed I could do anything as long as she was by my side. Physical closeness was a constant, unspoken thread in those good times. She'd brush against me in the kitchen, tug me closer in the middle of a store aisle, or wrap her arms around me while I worked at my desk. There was a hunger in her affection then, a warmth that reassured me I was wanted. I never had to question whether she desired me, whether she cherished our bond, because she showed it in 1,000 small ways every single day. To me, that was the foundation of love. Not just words, but actions, repeated over time, that told me I mattered. Our friends noticed too. They often commented on how connected we seemed, how natural our chemistry was. At dinners, we'd finish each other's sentences without realizing it. During game nights, we'd exchange glances that carried inside jokes no one else understood. People would say, "You two give us hope," and I'd smile because I truly believed we were living proof that love could last. I wore that identity proudly, as though our happiness was a badge of honor. Those good times were also when we built dreams together. Late at night, lying in bed, we would whisper about the future. We talked about the children we'd one day have, how we'd teach them to ride bikes on the quiet streets of Fairhaven, or how we'd take them on road trips across the country. Claire had a vision of planting a big garden where our kids could play while we watched from the porch. I wanted to design our forever home, a place filled with light and space for all the love we thought we'd have. Those conversations made me feel like we were co-authors of a beautiful story still unfolding. And that's what made the later years so devastating. The contrast between what we once had and what we became. The good times weren't a dream or an illusion. They were real, tangible, and full of love. They created the foundation of hope that kept me trying long after the signs of trouble appeared. They were the reason I held on, the reason I kept fighting for us even when it felt like I was the only one in the ring. Without those memories, I might have walked away sooner. But because of them, I stayed, believing we could somehow return to what we once had, blind to the truth that those days were already gone. The first cracks in our story didn't appear as dramatic explosions, but as small, almost unnoticeable shifts that at the time I brushed off as normal stress or passing moods. Looking back, I realized these were the warning signs I ignored, the faint tremors that preceded the earthquake. They didn't announce themselves with grand gestures. Instead, they crept into our daily lives like shadows lengthening at dusk, subtle but steady. At first, I told myself not to worry, that every relationship goes through its ebbs and flows. But the truth is, those early signs were the beginning of something I wasn't ready to name. One of the earliest indicators was her sudden impatience with the little rituals we had once cherished. Our pancake Sundays, for example, started to feel more like obligations than joys. Instead of humming in the kitchen or laughing when I spilled batter, Claire would sigh heavily, scrolling through her phone while I cooked alone. When I asked if something was wrong, she would shrug and say, "I'm just tired," without looking me in the eye. Those mornings, once filled with lightheartedness, now carried a heaviness I couldn't quite put my finger on. It felt as though the simple things that once connected us were becoming burdens to her. Another subtle change came in her body language. Claire had always been affectionate, reaching for my hand in public or leaning against me on the couch. But gradually she started to recoil. At first, it was slight, pulling her hand back under the table, leaning away when I touched her arm, or turning her face when I tried to kiss her cheek. Each time, she would cover it with a reason. "I'm sweaty," or "I don't want to smudge my makeup." They sounded believable in isolation, but over time the pattern became impossible to ignore. The woman who once sought my touch now seemed to avoid it altogether. Her words, too, carried an edge that hadn't been there before. She used to greet me warmly when I came home from work, asking about my day with genuine interest. But those greetings turned into distracted nods, followed by her retreating to the bedroom with her laptop. If I tried to talk, she often cut me short with lines like, "Can we not do this right now?" or "I've had enough noise today." I started to feel like a nuisance in my own home, an interruption rather than a partner. Then came the way she began to criticize me over small things. It wasn't the playful teasing we once shared, but sharp comments delivered with irritation. If I forgot to take the trash out, she'd snap, "Do I have to do everything around here?" If I misread a recipe while cooking, she'd roll her eyes and mutter, "Typical." These weren't massive arguments, but they chipped away at me, making me question whether I was good enough. And though I tried to laugh them off at first, the sting lingered long after her words faded. One evening in particular stands out as the moment I first felt a pit in my stomach that wouldn't go away. I had suggested we take a weekend trip to the mountains, something we had often done in the past to escape the noise of daily life. Claire used to love those getaways. Hiking during the day, campfires at night, the two of us wrapped in blankets under the stars. But when I brought it up, she sighed and said, "Honestly, that sounds exhausting. I don't want to spend my limited free time driving out to nowhere. Can't we just stay home?" Her tone wasn't just dismissive. It was almost resentful, as though I had asked for too much by suggesting something that once brought us joy. I nodded, swallowing my disappointment, but inside I knew something had shifted. Her work schedule also became a wall between us. Nights when I waited with dinner ready, she would text an hour late saying, "Don't wait up, I'll grab something on the way." At first, I believed she was simply overwhelmed by her responsibilities. But as those nights became more frequent, I couldn't help but wonder if her distance was more than just professional stress. She seemed more alive when talking about her projects than when she was with me. It was as if the energy she once reserved for us had been redirected elsewhere, leaving me with only the tired remnants of her day. Even our friends started to notice small changes, though they didn't say much. At gatherings, Claire was still outwardly warm and engaging, but I could sense her detachment. When someone asked about us, she would answer in clipped tones, often shifting the conversation back to her work. I caught her rolling her eyes once when I shared a story, quickly masking it with a laugh when others looked. It was such a small gesture, but it felt like a knife twisting in my chest. It made me wonder whether she still respected me, or if somewhere along the way I had become invisible to her. The most painful sign, however, came in the bedroom. Our intimacy, once so natural and joyful, dwindled until it became almost non-existent. Each time I reached for her, she responded with that same chilling refrain, "Don't touch me, I'm not in the mood." At first I thought it was just stress, but when it became a near-daily declaration, it felt like rejection not just of my touch, but of me as a person. It wasn't the absence of sex that hurt the most. It was the absence of closeness, the absence of being wanted. I would lie awake next to her, staring at the ceiling, wondering what I had done to make her push me away. Those were the warning signs, the sighs, the recoils, the dismissals, the silence. They weren't loud enough to shatter everything at once, but they were constant enough to erode the foundation we had built. I ignored them for far too long, convincing myself that love meant patience, that if I just held on we would find our way back. But deep down, a quiet voice whispered the truth, that something was unraveling, and I was powerless to stop it. The warning signs that once lingered in the background soon evolved into glaring problems that could no longer be dismissed as mere phases or temporary stress. What had started as subtle distance turned into sharp disconnection, and before I fully realized it, our relationship was no longer defined by warmth and partnership, but by silence, tension, and unspoken resentment. Where there was once laughter, there was now a heavy quiet, and where there had been understanding, there were walls I could not climb. It was in the small routines that the escalation showed itself most vividly. We used to have a rhythm to our evenings, where cooking dinner together was more than a task. It was an intimate dance. She would chop the vegetables while I handled the stove, and we would talk about everything and nothing in between. But soon, that ritual disappeared. Claire began ordering food almost every night, citing exhaustion or deadlines, and when I offered to cook, she brushed me off with a flat, "Don't bother, I'm not hungry." Some nights she ate in silence at the table, scrolling on her phone without once looking at me. Other nights she skipped dinner altogether, locking herself in the bedroom with her laptop while I sat in the living room, staring at the cold plates I had set out. The distance in those moments was unbearable, yet I told myself she just needed space, though deep down, I feared space was all she wanted. The way she spoke to me changed drastically too. Claire, who once filled my days with kindness and curiosity, now seemed to treat me as if my words had no value. When I tried to share something about my day, she would interrupt, "Can we not do this right now?" or "Is this really important?" Her dismissiveness stung more than outright cruelty would have, because it made me feel invisible. There were times I stopped mid-sentence because I saw her eyes glaze over, her attention drifting elsewhere. It was a slow realization that I had become background noise in her world, a voice she no longer cared to hear. Arguments became frequent, and unlike the healthy disagreements couples sometimes have, these were hostile and unresolved. They often erupted over trivial things, the way I folded laundry, the volume of the television, or my tendency to leave shoes by the door. Claire no longer argued to resolve issues. She argued to win. Her words became weapons, cutting deep into my insecurities. "You're so useless sometimes," she muttered once when I forgot to replace the empty toilet paper roll. Another time, When I made a suggestion about planning a trip, she snapped, "You have no idea how exhausting you are." These words weren't slips in moments of anger. They were repeated patterns, and each time they left scars that I tried to hide but couldn't ignore. The physical distance widened further, and intimacy became a foreign concept between us. Even casual touches, a hand on her shoulder, a brush of her hair, were met with recoils or sharp reminders. "Don't touch me." It had become her daily mantra, one she delivered with increasing irritation. Nights in bed grew colder, both literally and emotionally. She would roll to the far side, blanket pulled tightly around her, leaving me to stare at the ceiling, feeling like an intruder in my own home. I stopped reaching out eventually, not because I didn't want her, but because I couldn't bear the sting of rejection anymore. It was as though her body had become a fortress, and I was no longer permitted entry. There were also signs of something more troubling beneath the surface, secrets she no longer cared to hide. Claire began guarding her phone like it was an extension of her soul. She would tilt the screen away when I walked by, lock it the moment she set it down, and take it with her even when stepping into the bathroom. Calls came at odd hours, and when I asked who it was, she would dismiss me with "work," without elaboration. One evening, I heard her laugh softly in the other room while on a call, a kind of laugh I hadn't heard directed at me in months. When I entered, she ended it abruptly, muttering something about a colleague, but her defensive tone told me more than her words ever could. Even outside the home, her detachment was obvious. At a dinner with friends, Claire barely acknowledged me. She engaged with others, laughed at their jokes, and shared animated updates about her life. But when it came to me, she was silent, almost as if we weren't even together. At one point, a friend asked about our plans for the holidays, and before I could answer, Claire quickly said, "We'll figure it out if we even do anything," followed by an awkward laugh. Everyone at the table glanced at me, pity in their eyes, but I forced a smile to save face. That night, on the drive home, the silence between us was so thick it suffocated me. Perhaps the most painful escalation came not in the arguments or the silences, but in her indifference. Anger at least shows passion, but indifference is a void. There were days when I felt like a ghost living alongside her, unseen and unheard. I tried everything: acts of service, planning surprises, writing notes, even just listening without expectation, but nothing broke through. My efforts, once met with gratitude, now seemed to irritate her further, as though my attempts to connect were inconveniences she had to endure. It became clear that no matter what I did, the result would be the same: rejection, dismissal, or silence. By then, the house no longer felt like a home. It was a battlefield of cold shoulders and sharp words, with no safe corners to retreat to. I dreaded coming back from work because I knew I would walk into tension so thick it pressed against my chest. Yet, I stayed, convincing myself that love meant weathering storms. What I failed to see was that this wasn't a storm to endure. It was a steady dismantling of everything we had built, piece by painful piece. And as I clung to the fragments, Claire seemed more determined to let them scatter into the wind. It was during the height of that suffocating silence in our home that I realized I couldn't carry the weight of my confusion and pain alone anymore. I had spent months convincing myself that if I just tried harder, if I just gave Claire more space, if I just became quieter or more attentive, somehow things would go back to the way they used to be. But nothing worked. Instead, the distance grew wider, and I grew smaller within it. I needed someone outside of the situation to help me see what I was too blinded by hope to admit. The first person I turned to was my younger sister, Lydia. She had always been the one I could confide in without fear of judgment. One Saturday afternoon, I asked if she wanted to meet me for coffee. Sitting across from her in that small cafe, I struggled to put my feelings into words. My voice shook as I explained how Claire had been shutting me out, how her "don't touch me" had gone from an occasional response to a daily rejection, and how I felt like a stranger in my own relationship. Lydia didn't interrupt me once. She just listened, her eyes filled with the kind of concern that only someone who loves you unconditionally can show. When I finally finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Ethan," she said softly, "this isn't how love is supposed to feel. You're trying to hold on to something that she clearly doesn't want to give anymore. That's not your failure. It's her choice." Her words struck me like a hammer. I had been so focused on what I was doing wrong that it hadn't even occurred to me that maybe the problem wasn't entirely mine to fix. Lydia went on, gently but firmly, pointing out things I hadn't noticed or had chosen to ignore. She reminded me of how distant Claire had been at family gatherings, how she always seemed irritated by my presence, and how even in photos her smile never reached her eyes when she stood beside me. "It's like she checked out a long time ago," Lydia said. "You're the only one still fighting to pretend it's okay." Later that week, I spoke to my closest friend Marcus, someone who had known me since college. We met at a bar after work, and as we sat with our beers, I let the truth spill out in a way I never had before. Marcus leaned back, shaking his head slowly as I recounted the constant dismissals, the avoidance, the guarded phone, and the icy silence. When I told him about Claire's daily rejection, her repeated "don't touch me," he sighed heavily and said, "Man, that's not a relationship anymore. That's a prison sentence." He wasn't trying to be cruel. He was just cutting through the fog of denial I had wrapped myself in. He reminded me of the Ethan he used to know, the one who was full of life, always laughing, always the first to suggest an adventure. "I haven't seen that guy in years," Marcus admitted. "And honestly, I think Claire has been slowly killing that part of you. You're not you anymore." Hearing it from both Lydia and Marcus was like having a mirror held up to my face. I had spent so long rationalizing Claire's behavior, blaming stress, work, or even myself, that I had failed to recognize the truth. I wasn't just in a rough patch. I was in a one-sided relationship where my efforts meant nothing. Their validation made me realize I wasn't crazy for feeling unseen and unloved. It wasn't all in my head. Claire had truly withdrawn, and I was the only one still clinging to the remnants of what we once were. The validation didn't stop there. At work, a colleague I wasn't particularly close to noticed I seemed drained and asked if everything was okay. It startled me at first because I thought I was hiding it well, but when she said, "You look like you've been carrying the weight of the world," I nearly broke down right there. I brushed it off with a vague comment, but later, in the quiet of my car, I realized just how obvious my unhappiness had become. If even casual acquaintances could see it, then how long had I been fooling myself? Even my parents, who rarely interfered in my personal life, sensed something was wrong. During a Sunday dinner, my father asked gently if Claire and I were doing all right. His tone was careful, but his eyes betrayed a deeper concern. When I hesitated to answer, my mother chimed in. "Sweetheart, we just want you to be happy. Lately, you don't seem like yourself." I brushed off their worries in the moment, but their words echoed in my mind later that night. Happiness had become such a distant memory that I wasn't sure I'd recognize it anymore. What struck me most in these conversations was the consistency of the message. Everyone who loved me, everyone who saw me clearly, agreed that something was fundamentally broken. It wasn't just me imagining it, and it wasn't something that could be fixed by me sacrificing more of myself. That realization was both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it confirmed what I had been dreading, that Claire no longer wanted me in the way I needed her to. Liberating because it meant I could stop blaming myself for the disintegration of our relationship. Still, knowing the truth and accepting it were two different battles. Part of me wanted to cling to the hope that if I just endured a little longer, she might come back around. But the voices of those I trusted most wouldn't let me slip back into denial. Their concern became a chorus in my head, urging me to see that I deserved better than to live in the shadow of someone else's indifference. And so, for the first time in months, I allowed myself to imagine a different future. A life not defined by rejection and cold shoulders, but by the possibility of peace and self-worth. It was terrifying, but it was also the first flicker of light I had felt in what seemed like an endless tunnel. There comes a moment in every unraveling when denial finally cracks, when the walls you've built to protect yourself from the truth collapse under their own weight. For me, that moment came on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday night, the kind of night that should have passed quietly into memory, but instead became the turning point I could never walk back from. I came home late from work, drained and hopeful in equal measure. I had picked up Claire's favorite Thai food on the way, thinking maybe this small gesture would soften the edges between us. I walked through the door, balancing the paper bags in my hands, and called out her name. No answer. The lights in the living room were dim, her laptop glowing on the coffee table, and her phone buzzed incessantly beside it. Normally, she guarded that device like it contained state secrets, but tonight, it was left unattended, vibrating with message after message. Against my better judgment, I glanced at the screen. What I saw made my heart plummet into my stomach. The notifications weren't from work. They were from someone saved simply as A. Short, playful messages appeared in rapid succession. Last night was amazing. Can't stop thinking about you. Wish you were here instead of there. My knees went weak, and I sat down hard on the couch, the bags of food spilling onto the floor. For months I had suspected her distance might mean something like this, but seeing the words spelled out left no room for denial. She wasn't just attached. She was with someone else, emotionally, if not entirely physically. When Claire finally walked through the door, cheerful in a way I hadn't seen directed at me in months, I confronted her. My voice trembled as I asked who A was. For a moment, her expression froze, her mask slipping just long enough for guilt to flicker in her eyes. Then came the denial, sharp and defensive. "It's just a friend," she snapped. "Don't snoop through my things." But her tone, her body language, everything about her screamed otherwise. I pressed further, and that's when she exploded. "You suffocate me, Ethan. I've told you I'm not in the mood. I've told you I need space, and still you keep pushing. Why can't you understand that I don't want this anymore?" Her words cut deeper than any blade could. She wasn't just asking for space. She was telling me outright that our relationship, as I had known it, was over. The finality of that statement broke something inside me. All the small rejections, the cold silences, the indifference, they all culminated in this moment of brutal honesty. She no longer loved me, and she hadn't for a long time. The woman I had fought so hard to reach was already gone, replaced by someone who didn't care enough to even pretend anymore. I remember standing there in the wreckage of our kitchen, the spilled food still on the floor, feeling like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. This was rock bottom, not because I had discovered her betrayal, but because I finally realized there was no salvaging what we had. The days that followed were some of the darkest of my life. I moved through them in a fog, going through the motions of work and daily tasks while carrying the crushing weight of finality. Nights were the worst. I would lie awake, staring at the empty space beside me, haunted by memories of when that space was filled with warmth and laughter. The bed felt like a graveyard of everything I had lost. I replayed her words over and over in my head. "I don't want this anymore," until they became a chant that hollowed me out. What made it worse was watching her indifference. Claire didn't apologize, she didn't try to explain, she simply carried on as though nothing monumental had happened. She stayed out later, took more calls in hushed tones, and treated me like an unwanted guest in a home we were supposed to share. Her detachment was a cruelty I hadn't anticipated, a confirmation that my pain meant nothing to her. That, more than the betrayal, pushed me to the edge. To love someone so deeply only to realize you were nothing more than an inconvenience to them. It was a kind of heartbreak I wouldn't wish on anyone. But even in that pit of despair, a strange clarity began to form. I thought back to Lydia's words at the cafe, Marcus's blunt honesty at the bar, my parents' concerned glances across the dinner table. They had all seen what I had refused to accept. Claire had checked out long ago, and I had been clinging to a ghost. Rock bottom stripped me of every excuse, every denial, and left me face to face with the truth. I could not make someone love me who had already chosen to walk away. The breaking point wasn't just about Claire's betrayal. It was about reclaiming my own dignity. For months, I had begged silently for scraps of affection, shrinking myself in the hope she might notice me again. But seeing those messages, hearing her dismissal, and enduring her indifference made one thing painfully clear. I had to stop begging for what she would never give. I had to stop trying, not for her, but for me. I remember one particular evening, about a week after the confrontation. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, looking at the reflection of a man I barely recognized. My eyes were sunken, my face drawn, my shoulders slumped under the invisible weight I carried. I whispered to myself, "This isn't who you are." For the first time in months, I believed it. Rock bottom didn't just break me, it awakened me. It forced me to see that my worth wasn't tied to Claire's validation, that love shouldn't feel like rejection on repeat. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, a pen and notebook in front of me, and I wrote down everything I wanted from life moving forward: respect, peace, joy, connection. Things that had been absent for so long that they felt like luxuries. I wrote them as promises to myself, vows that I would never again settle for the kind of emptiness I had endured. It was the first step, small but significant, toward reclaiming the person I had lost in the storm of our crumbling relationship. And as I closed that notebook and set it aside, I knew with absolute certainty that this was the end of the line. Rock bottom wasn't just the lowest point. It was also the beginning of something else, something I didn't yet have the strength to name but could finally begin to imagine. When rock bottom stripped away all my illusions, what remained was a choice. I could stay in the ruins, clinging to the hope that Claire might one day turn back to me, or I could reclaim what little strength I had left and walk away for good. For months, I had been paralyzed by the fear of losing her, of facing life without the woman I had once believed was my forever. But standing at that threshold now, I realized I had already lost her long before. She was gone, and the only thing left to do was free myself from the grip of a love that no longer existed. The decision didn't come with fire or fury, it came with quiet resolve. One morning I woke up and knew I couldn't endure another day of rejection, silence, and indifference. I began to make plans in the only way I knew how, methodically, carefully, as though piecing together a puzzle. I started small, collecting my personal belongings from around the house. The books I had stacked by the bedside, the jacket that hung unused in the closet, the photographs that still sat in dusty frames. Each item I packed felt like reclaiming a piece of myself, a reminder that I still existed outside of her cold shadow. When I told Claire I was leaving, her reaction was a mixture of indifference and annoyance. "Do what you want," she said flatly, as though my departure was no more consequential than the weather. That stung more than I expected, but it also solidified my decision. There was no dramatic plea, no sudden realization on her part. She had moved on long before, and now it was my turn. I loaded my car with boxes, closed the door to what had once been our home, and drove away without looking back. The first days on my own were disorienting. I moved into a small apartment across town, one that barely fit my things but offered a strange kind of comfort in its emptiness. For the first time in years, every corner of a space was mine, untainted by tension or rejection. At night, the silence was deafening, but it was also peaceful. There was no weight pressing down on me, no voice telling me to stop, no daily rejection that made me question my worth. The solitude, though difficult, was liberating. I leaned heavily on the people who had been my lifeline through the storm. Lydia came over often, bringing groceries and filling the space with her warmth. Marcus dragged me out to places I hadn't been in years, reminding me what it felt like to laugh freely. My parents called more frequently, their concerns softening into relief as they saw me slowly coming back to myself. These connections reminded me of something vital, that I wasn't alone, even when I felt hollow. Others believed in my ability to rebuild, even when I struggled to see it. Healing didn't happen overnight. There were days I woke up aching, the memories of Claire clinging to me like ghosts. I would catch myself reaching for my phone to text her, only to remember the chapter was closed. Grief, I realized, wasn't just about losing a person. It was about losing the future you thought you had, the version of life you had envisioned together. I mourned that future deeply, but each day, the mourning became less sharp. Slowly, I began to fill the empty spaces with new routines. Morning runs through the park, journaling at night, experimenting with cooking meals just for myself. Each small act was a reminder that I could create joy on my own terms. One particular morning stands out. I was sitting on the balcony of my apartment, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't thinking about her. I wasn't replaying arguments, dissecting her rejection, or questioning my worth. I was simply there, present in the moment, and it struck me how light I felt. The absence of her indifference was like taking a deep breath after being underwater too long. That morning, I understood what peace felt like, and I promised myself I would never again settle for a love that starved me. In time, reflection replaced bitterness. I stopped seeing myself as a victim of Claire's choices and began recognizing the lessons hidden in the pain. I learned that love cannot survive on effort from one side alone. I learned that silence and rejection are just as destructive as shouting matches. Most importantly, I learned that my worth isn't tied to someone else's ability to see it. Claire's daily refrain, "Don't touch me, I'm not in the mood," once felt like a dagger to my heart. Now I see it as the echo of her own disconnection, not a measure of my value. Looking back, I don't regret the love I gave. I regret how long I stayed, begging for scraps when I deserved a feast. But even that regret has softened, replaced by gratitude for the resilience I discovered within myself. I walked away broken, but I rebuilt piece by piece, and what emerged was stronger, clearer, and more determined never to lose myself in someone else again. Today, when I share my story, it isn't with anger but with the hope that others might see their own reflection in my experience. To anyone who has felt the sting of constant rejection, the ache of indifference, I say this: you deserve more. Love should not feel like begging at a locked door. It should feel like being welcomed home. And if you find yourself hearing the same dismissive words day after day, take it from me. Don't wait until rock bottom to reclaim yourself. Choose peace sooner. As for me, I no longer live in the shadow of Claire's rejection. I live in the light of my own freedom, my own healing, and my own worth. And though the scars remain, they are reminders of where I've been, not chains keeping me tied to the past. I stopped trying forever, not because I gave up on love, but because I finally chose to love myself enough to walk away. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.